Something I think a lot about in HR is power. How do power differentials affect how we lead in our organizations? Well, we've got an expert here to talk about that in a related context. And here we are on the HR Hub podcast with me, Andrea Adams. Keep listening to learn about this and anything related to HR. You can also find me on YouTube. So today, my guest is again Connelly. As I said before, I found her by asking ChatGPT for an expert on the future of work, and her name popped up. She's an HR professor at McMaster University, and I think she has a real strong interest in research. She looks at workplace behavior, employee well-being, and diversity. She's written a book, she's written multiple books, I think, but including one related to our topic today called Enduring Work, Experiences with Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program. Hi, Catherine. How are you?
Hi. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks for coming on. So we are going to talk about the work you've done researching Canada's Temporary Foreign Worker Program. That really intrigued me because there is such a stark difference in power between the leaders in an organization and those foreign workers who, should they mess up, could be sent home and really don't want to be sent home. Mm-hmm. So sort of thinking about that power context, can you tell me broadly what the outcome of your study of the Temporary Foreign Worker Program revealed?
Sure thing, Andrea. Yeah. So to do my research, I talked to over 100 temporary foreign workers in Canada, as well as employers, as well as other people connected to the program broadly. And what I found was that sometimes this program works exactly as intended and is just great for everyone. And then other times, because of this power differential that you're mentioning, sometimes it is not working out very well for the employees, right?
Uh-huh.
And so what we have are people who have high level of expertise, especially if they're in the high wage program. These are people who clearly have a lot of value added that they bring to the organization. So you would expect that they would have a high level of power and that there would not be much of a power differential. But the issue is structural in that these employees, they have what's known as a closed work permit. And so this means that they are tied to that very specific employer and that they cannot leave. And so the employer can ask for, pretty much whatever they want and then get it. And the employee is pretty powerless in that employment relationship.
To ensure that the employee is treated decently, we're just depending on the ethics of that particular employer.
Yes. So what we found, even more recently, is that there's very little oversight of this program by the federal government. So it's a federal program. Employment standards are provincial in Canada, but it is a federal program, and there's very little oversight. So there's a website you can go to that has a blacklist of all the companies who are not allowed to use this program again because their mistreatment of workers was so severe. But this is a massive program, and the government has not been able to keep up with the demand in terms of the huge numbers of employees who go through this program. And so at one point, they were actually instructing their government workers to not verify if this was a real company trying to hire people, or if this was an actual lawyer who was facilitating this process. So, yeah, so you're right, Andrea. The whole architecture of this program really rests on the goodwill of the company to be following all the contracts and all the rules around what's going on, and then the employee to hold up their bargain and to be a solid worker as well.
Taking what you've learned from this program, and because that's a federal program and that's federal policy, and our intentions, we're implementing our own policies. What have you learned from that we can apply in our organizations? Because leaders in an organization have lots more power than,
Mhm.
the people on the front line. How do we need to safeguard workers?
Yeah, so something that really surprised me was what was going on within organizations that likely the upper management had probably no idea what was happening. And so often they will have policies about fairness and making sure workers are treated well. But it just takes one rogue manager to say to an employee, hey, you owe me $1,000, or I'd like you to work the weekend unpaid, or I'm not going to give you holiday pay, or like this is not necessarily what the company wants to happen. But if there's not enough internal oversight, what I have found is it actually does happen. And there are larger organizations that are upset or angry when the transgressions do occur, but they're relying on employees to blow the whistle, right?
Ah,
And it's not always going to happen, right?
yeah.
So to be effective, an organization really needs to have some internal processes where they are checking in with their frontline employees to make sure that everything is unfolding the way the company wants it to.
How do you suggest organizations do that? Check in with those frontline employees who might, who have employment vulnerability,
Mhm.
um, to ensure that workplace standards are being followed.
Yeah, so part of it is just to have open channels. And
Hmm.
so ideally, what you want is for an employee who has noticed an issue. So maybe it's a safety issue, maybe it's a compensation issue, could be
Mm,
about their accommodation. So if they've noticed an issue, ideally, you want them to come to you first, and you can just straighten this out pretty quick. Um,
yeah.
because otherwise, they're likely to talk to employment standards, or they might talk to the
Right.
government, or
Yeah.
there will be bigger problems the longer this goes on, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
you want open
Yes.
channels. The thing is, a lot of temporary foreign workers are very reluctant to complain,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And so they do not want to cause waves. They just want everything to just be fine. They will endure it, and then they're hoping eventually it just is better in the future, right? And so ideally, the organization would have some kind of exit interview to close the loop when anybody is leaving, because at that
Yeah.
point, the person
Yeah.
will feel much more comfortable raising an issue. And that's when you might find that, okay, you have a rogue line manager who is extracting money from your employees, or other violations that it's nothing that the company wants to happen, but they'll never find out unless they proactively either keep those channels open or find out information from the employees who are leaving.
Extracting from that program, what takeaways do we have, like for an organization,
Mhm.
about creating and enforcing organization policy?
So I think part of it depends a little bit on the size of the organization,
Hmm.
right? And how easy it is for HR or senior management to be aware of what is going on in the organization. So, one pattern that I noticed was that the temporary foreign workers who are very vulnerable, they were very frequently kept isolated from the rest of the workforce.
Mm.
Sometimes this happened just organically or accidentally because they were on the night shift. They were considered to have the
Right.
lowest
Right. Yeah.
seniority, and so they would automatically be um, kept separate, right? And so it kind of reminds me of when you have an accounting team. You want to really make sure that those people all take their vacations for at least 2 weeks, because you want to find out if there's a problem, and you will only find it out when they're gone, right? Because you want to have some sunlight on
Yeah.
every aspect of your operations, right?
Hmm.
And so it's the same sort of thing. Structurally, you don't want to have employees that work for you and no one ever sees or ever talks to. right? So to the extent that you can have your temporary foreign workers integrated with the rest
Mhm,
of your workforce,
mhm.
structurally, that will be a little bit better. Frequently, these are extremely experienced workers, right? So they have worked for years in other contexts and then have chosen to come to Canada for future citizenship or something like that. On top of that, um, if there is an issue, you will find out about it much quicker, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And that's what you want. Like, you don't want
yeah.
there to be problems, but if there is going to be a problem, you want to know right away, right?
Mhm.
And then the other aspect is to make sure that all of the policies for the company are communicated very clearly to every employee. And so because of that, that consistency, people will appreciate that, okay, nobody's getting treated better or worse. It's the same across everybody. And then it becomes also easier to implement.
It's taking lots of things away for, internally and including that point around your rogue managers.
Yeah.
In HR, we depend on our managers to do a good job, but we can't 100% trust that they're doing a good job. We need
hmm
to do ours as well.
hmm
I did some episodes with an immigration consultant in the States, and he spoke to the value of foreign workers, that they come with a different work ethic, that sometimes, all these statements that, Canadian workers, or it probably applies to young Canadian workers, young American workers, are entitled, that foreign temporary workers or foreign workers may not come with that. Um, should we be hiring more foreign workers?
Yeah. So it's funny. People will ask me that too. And they'll say, like, young people these days. And when I hear
Yeah.
that, I think, man, those people are meeting different young people than I meet. Because the
Oh,
ones
yeah.
I meet, they're amazing. But they're so energetic, they're curious, they're excited. So I tend to think, yeah, young people are great. And I like working with them. But that said, yeah, foreign workers are also amazing, right? They bring so much. Where possible, I tend to recommend that organizations try to use the other work visa programs just because it's cheaper and simpler, right? So if somebody is coming under experience class or the IMP program, they don't have to apply for permission to hire that worker under the labor market impact assessment program, which costs
Uh,
$1,000, right? So temporary foreign worker program, it's so convoluted and time consuming. A lot of companies end up hiring a consultant to help them manage it. It's just a whole rigmarole. It's just maybe worth it if you really need a very specialized person who is from a country that does not have a free trade agreement with Canada.
mhm.
But probably with enough lead time, you are likely to be able to hire someone within Canada if you really look, or from a different country where they are able to come a little bit more easily.
Mhm.
The one downside is they can quit on you, right?
Ah, the
But
downside, they can quit
yeah,
on you.
but
But we're talking about power here.
yeah, but the thing is, like, everybody can quit. Everybody else you hired, they're still there, right? So
Yeah.
if it's a good environment and you've treated them fairly um, and respectfully, like, they are likely to stay, right?
Yeah, but then it just means that the lousy employers, because they can't get and keep their own employees, they're gonna go prey upon people from another country.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cycle, right? So, like, the good employers tend to attract people and they tend to stay, and it's just kind of
Yeah.
gets better and better.
You
One,
see that in HR, like in HR consulting all the time. Like,
yeah,
you've got a high turnover. It's a solvable problem.
yeah.
In your research, what have you learned about the impact of cultural differences in how people are speaking up at work?
Yeah, so in Canada, we tend to have relatively flat organizations and not a lot of power
Oh,
distance between even the top boss
mhm,
and somebody who's entry level. So, for
mhm.
example, if I'm working at a company, I can likely call the president by his first name, and that would be fine. It doesn't mean we're buddies or
Yep.
anything, but he would likely call me by my first name and vice versa, right? And
Mhm.
so it might be uncomfortable for a Canadian to say to their boss or their boss's boss, this has happened and it's a problem, right? People would still feel awkward about it or a little bit nervous, but it's conceivable, and it's something that your friends and family would encourage you to speak up. Coupled with that, we tend to be fairly well aware of what is normal in a workplace and what's
Mhm.
allowed and what's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
allowed,
right.
right? And if you don't know, well, your friends and family would help you, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so contrast that with somebody who is coming from an environment where maybe those labor standards exist on paper but are never enforced,
Mhm.
right? Where
Yeah.
it's inconceivable for a company to be fined for violating worker safety, right? That would just
Right.
never happen, right? Even though the rights might exist on paper, it's just not a thing. Um, and then that culture. So, for example, take the Philippines, for example. There's greater power distance, right? So you would address your boss by Mr. So and so. You'd be very deferential, very respectful. Um, and to go against that would just be inconceivable. And then meanwhile, like your friends and family would just wonder, like, what are you even doing? Like, why are you acting that way? And that the appropriate way to behave is to be um, respectful and know your place, and that they have a responsibility to you, but you have a responsibility to just, well, stay quiet, right? Like the Canadian system is kind of set up expecting people to complain,
Yes. Yes, they are. Yeah.
right? And not everybody is going to complain. And so I think we just need to anticipate that. And it's not that we want people to need to complain, but if they do need to, and if something's going on, the structures need to be there to support somebody who is speaking up. And everybody needs to know that if some worker who is a temporary foreign worker has the whisper of a potential complaint, that needs to be really looked into.
Oh, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Um, and if that initial response is, oh, yeah, you're fine, don't worry about it, then they will never hear anything from them ever again. And it does not mean that the problem has gone away.
One more question. What percentage if you want to just take a wild stab at it, I'm assuming you'll do this.
Mhm.
Uh, in the percentage of all your research, what percentage of managers were good managers or organizations were good versus the ones that were not?
That's interesting. So I would say 80% completely fine.
Right.
And they were using the program as intended, and it was working reasonably well. So I would say maybe 10-15%, there's something not being done properly,
Hmm.
and contracts were not being followed, and it was a real problem and it should have been fixed. Um, and this is like safety violations, or it's not paying people, or like
Hmm.
all that type of serious violations. 5%, I think, would be absolutely egregious in
Hmm.
terms of this is approaching human trafficking, people not being allowed to leave the premises of their employer, their passports being seized, like really, really bad, or harassment and abuse, like just really terrible.
Hmm.
So,
Okay.
so any amount is bad, but
Yeah, yeah.
it is more than I was expecting, because I think I went into it just with And understanding, okay, a lot of the work that people would be doing might be difficult or unpleasant, and that's why a Canadian could not have been found. Like, I was expecting to hear about unpleasant work. I was not prepared for the scope or the depth of some of the mistreatment, and it was it really affected me because I was talking to people who were just lovely, and they deserved none of what they went through. It was just really bad.
How can people find out about you, learn more about the topic,
Mm-hmm.
or learn more about the impact of power differences in HR?
So I would encourage everybody to buy a copy of my book. It's called Enduring Work. And this is about the Canadian Temporary Foreign Worker Program. I think it's interesting for anybody in Canada and especially people in HR.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you, find you?
So people can friend me on LinkedIn. Just look for Catherine Connelly at McMaster University. Or they can look at my webpage. It's connellyresearch.com, and it has links to other interviews I've done, as well as my research and some infographics in case they are interested in different topics.
Interesting. Yeah, I am interested.
And they can also find me at the McMaster University Expert Guide.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, thanks, Catherine. That was revealing about the nature of humans with power. I'm glad you said that 80% were just fine, but I think it would be naive of us in HR to not be mindful of that other 20%, and especially the 5. But thanks for listening out there. We'll catch you next time when I talk with another insightful guest.